Call to order the Village of Lake Bluff Finance Committee meeting. This is Monday, June 22nd, 2020. May we have a roll call, please?
Chair Ankerman?
Here.
Member Meyer?
Here.
Member Toll?
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. The first item of business before we get to the minutes would be this declaration that I need to read. Pursuant to recently adopted amendments to the Illinois Open Meetings Act, included in Public Act 101-0640, public bodies may, in certain circumstances, hold entirely virtual meetings without a quorum physically present in any one location. On March 18th, 2020, Village President Kathleen O'Hara issued a declaration of emergency pursuant to the authority granted by the Village Code, the Illinois Municipal Code, and the Illinois Emergency Management Agency Act to address the health threat posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. On May 29th, 2020, Governor Pritzker issued a disaster proclamation that declared in-person attendance at public meetings of more than 10 people at the regular public meeting location to be infeasible, in accordance with the Open Meetings Act as amended by Public Act 101-0640. On June 16th, 2020, Village President O'Hara executed a written determination that given the ongoing emergency associated with the COVID-19 pandemic, in-person meetings of the Village Board are not practical or prudent at this time and until further notice. In accordance with the Governor's disaster proclamation and the Village President's declaration of emergency and determination regarding meetings of the Village Board, I, as Chair of the Finance Committee of the Village of Lake Bluff, hereby determine that in-person meetings of the Lake Bluff Finance Committee are not practical or prudent at this time and until further notice. Okay. So our first order of business is the approval of the minutes from our last meeting, which is June 8th, 2020. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Thank you. A
Second.
Thank you, Bill. Do we have any clarifications, corrections to be made to the minutes?
No.
Okay. Hearing none, may we have a roll call to approve, please?
Chair Ankerman?
Aye.
Member Toll?
Aye.
Member Meyer?
Aye.
Thank you.
Okay. So the next order of business is our continued discussion regarding the FY21-22 revenue and expense modifications in light of the current projections due to the COVID-19 crisis. May I ask you, Drew, to kind of catch us up to date on what has happened between the last meeting and this meeting?
Certainly. So at the last meeting, the Finance Committee asked staff to have a conversation with the Whites to determine if participation to get this project done this fiscal year was a possibility. That conversation was had. The Whites indicated a willingness to participate, but weren't prepared to throw a number out there to begin the negotiations, asked the village to place such a number. And what was told to them, I told them that village staff would work to see if there was a rational means to derive a participation figure for them, or sharing, if you will. And since then, staff has gone back and re-reviewed this project in light of the solution that was selected, and went back and revisited essentially three projects. The first being the pipe solution that daylights further down the street. That is this project that's the $270,000 and change that we've been discussing. And the second project that we discussed was probably the simplest solution, which involved piping the water behind the whites and their neighbors to the north and taking that stormwater into the railroad area, the railroad right-of-way. And we went back and actually reached out to Union Pacific officials who reminded us why that was not an option, essentially saying that we told you a year ago that things were very, for the lack of a better term, bureaucratic dealing with them, that we would have to make application, there would be application fees, and you shouldn't even bother because we're going to tell you no. That message was reaffirmed again last week with UP railroad officials. In fact, they actually said it's actually more complicated and cumbersome than when we spoke a year ago. And then the other project that was talked about was another solution that the village had explored, which involved the stormwater, essentially moving the stormwater from the White's property over to a neighboring property to the east, which would take the water in an overland flow route through the middle of their rear yard and through the other neighbors' properties. That project was estimated at about $150,000. And when that was first explored, the Whites were not interested in entertaining that as a potential solution because they didn't feel like they would have wanted to hand off the problem to a neighbor and felt like that's what that was doing. Even though the natural flow of water is to take it that direction in terms of elevations. Jeff, did I speak to that project clearly and identify the cost and what it involves?
Yeah, that's the cost. We didn't have any, easement or any other property rights acquisition in that number, which could have driven it higher.
But that was the other alternative we discussed. And what we were trying to find out if there was a solution that existed in terms of a sharing formula that could be, in a perfect world, that would make sense for this project. Like, for example, if we said that to design a solution that would secure the village's 10-year road project, the 10-year storm event that would keep water off the road up until a 10-year event, or alternatively, a project scope or scale that would cure the Whites problem. What if you could say that whatever the delta is to cure the other party, whether it be the village or the private property owner's problem, would it be a sharing solution within that? And the answer was no. The pipe that solves the village's problem solves the Whites problem, and vice versa. The Whites solution solves the village's problem. So there wasn't a wonderful solution there. The other alternative that staff had kicked around was simply saying one alternative the Finance Committee could discuss would be splitting it 50-50 if the village wanted to, was willing to take on the project this year, given the COVID-19 uncertainty impacts to our economic revenue streams, that if the Whites were interested in seeing the project done this fiscal year, that perhaps they participate in a 50-50 cost sharing, or alternatively wait and see if next year if the project can be reinserted back into the capital program. So that's the extent. Unfortunately, there was not an elegant solution amongst those series that were examined. We were hoping so, but we couldn't find one necessarily. But it's not to say that there aren't some, I guess, numbers or starting places out there.
Right.
I have a question, and it might be directed to Jeff. Would the $150,000 project, would that solve the roadway problem as well, or would that just solve the Whites problem?
It would just be for the Whites, because it would be after the water already dumps off the roadway into their property.
Okay, thank you.
Question for Drew. Drew, taking you back a moment, what if theoretically the UP Railroad solution were possible, what was the cost of that again?
Jeff had ballparked it at $100K. Is that about right, Jeff? We would still need 2 easements for that, but I think the parties at least have indicated a willingness to be part of a solution. One's the Whites, obviously, the other's the Gallaghers to the north. Is that right, Jeff?
Yeah, about 100 plus whatever, permit and dealing with the railroad would cost us.
Yeah, so that's at just a little more than a third of what we are projecting the current cost to be of what seems to otherwise be the project that makes the most sense. And I suppose the question I ask, and I don't mean to raise trouble with this, but when one looks at the entire situation, there's a gigantic ravine there that can probably take a lot of water, that's probably already taken a lot of water. And it seems the recalcitrance of the UP Railroad in resisting what might be the most simple and fair solution is, to say the least, disappointing. Would I be correct to say that fighting the railroad any further is something that would far outstrip, the cost of that would far outstrip any value we might derive from it, Drew or Peter, for that matter?
I think the biggest enemy of that is time, right? If there's a concern to do this now or even next year, I would venture to it'd just be speculation about when we could secure approval and or permit from the railroad. Again, them saying, the best they could do, our local rep would be able to help nudge the process along on their side of Omaha and getting it through the main office there. But there would be no promises in terms of timing. Is it worth, it's hard to say if they would ever even do it and issue a permit to the village. Again, the preliminary reaction was a no, don't bother wasting your money to even ask. I mean, that was, Jeff, help me out. Who was in the room when that conversation was had on the UP side?
The Whites initially talked to the UP, and then they said, wow, this is not good. And they handed it off to me, and we had that talk. I think it was just you and I. But I would say it's probably $10,000 in permit fees and engineering just to get them something in a form that they will look at to be told no. So there is a financial commitment just to get it in front of them, and then probably getting nowhere with that.
Okay. All right. I just wanted to make sure we exhausted that route, and it sounds like certainly we have. Thank you.
We should be conscious of the fact that is not strictly speaking a ravine. It's not completely benign in that a question that the railroad would certainly want to understand is whether or not there's potential for erosion of their ballast and anything that might undermine their trackage with some unknown or perhaps maximal amount of water coming in there and what it might do at the outflow point. So it would seem to me that has certain complications with it as well.
So if it's all right, Trustee Inkerman, I'd like to add, Jeff, could you give, I guess, the Finance Committee probably the one thing they don't want to hear, and that's the added pressure of the practical construction season window closing?
Yeah, the construction window is going to close in November to get the street patched, because this does involve cutting the street. And the better, if we want the best bid we can get, I like to give the contractor scheduling flexibility. So if we were to go ahead today, we would bid it, in July. We'd have a contractor lined up. They wouldn't be able to start after the contracts are completed to at least the start of August. And that leaves them, 2-3 month window to fit the project in, which isn't undoable, but that can certainly, if you scare off a couple of bidders and you only have 4 or 5 to begin with, now you're picking from a thinned out crop of applicants, and then you could end up paying quite a bit more based on whatever they want to bid.
So Jeff, is it fair to say this is the Finance Committee's real, probably last opportunity to discuss whether taking this project on or not this year?
I would like to think so. Like I said, we're just going to shrink our pool of potential contractors the longer we wait.
Well, and another concern I have is that we've got an estimate of 270, but it sounds like what we're saying is perhaps due to the short time period that we're asking this to be turned around, if we're going to do it this year, it may not even be 270. It might be higher than that. Is that correct?
That number 270, I think, includes a little bit for maybe about 20,000 for engineering inspection. And we try to push that down a little bit if we have to meet budget on other projects. We probably do the same here. I think the cost estimate is good. And just like the range that you're going to get as you shorten the time frame is going to widen, to the top end. When you get the bid, you can always put it out for bids and then not award it if your bids are too high.
Right.
But we haven't gotten that point to put it out for bids yet.
So it looks like the question before us all is geared around time. So this particular item was taken out of the budget due to the COVID-19 crisis, and putting it back in the budget at this point, it involves a lot of unknown in terms of what we're going to get for revenues. And so we need to weigh whether we should put it in this year, not knowing, having all this information be quite incomplete, or if we want to take it out, keep it out of this year, and then see if it makes the criteria for the budget for next year to be on the docket. It's all a matter of timing. So if we are to consider putting it back in for this year, I think we should talk a little bit more about the cost sharing that was discussed briefly, the ways in which we might ask for participation.
Barbara, a question. I think you very aptly point out that this is quite the issue of timing. What is the option we have in terms of doing it first thing next year? Because we'll have more information about how COVID is going to go, how our budget will be impacted. Is there a possibility of having this be first on the agenda of work next year in such a relation to the timing of the spring rains that it would make a difference?
I guess Jeff would best answer the ability to get something done in time. And it doesn't seem like that would get done in time because of winter, and by the time it opens up for something to be done, it's too late. We're already into the Regis, did you have something to share?
Yes, I mean, if you're gonna estimate the number of times that will get flooded, basically, I mean, what is the frequency per year, and can we wait until next May to do the work, basically knowing that they will have a same occur? I mean, how many times will they have an occurrence of rain that will be damaging to their house? Can we answer that question on an average? And if so, if we can answer it, if we can say maybe that will happen once or none, or 2 or 3 times, we would be able to answer from a financial standpoint.
I think history has shown that it's less than once per year. So if that's the metric that you're using, then it's pretty low risk to wait until next year, because it's 3 times over since 2015. Is that right, Jeff? Do I remember that correctly?
That sounds like what the Whites have reported since 2017.
3 times.
I think it's 3 times.
17. Okay. So right around once a year. So I guess, I mean, obviously there's no guarantee, but if we're looking at the risk of waiting until next year, I guess there would be some, but it would likely be less than once per year.
So there's a possibility. There is one possibility, basically. That's the point.
Mm-hmm.
I guess my issue is that I do sympathize with the Whites. We had it in the budget. I'm sure they were very excited. And we've had to, I mean, everybody's had to cancel a lot of plans this year, right? So I do want to see, I would really like to see something done this year. If we can do it, I think if we can figure out the cost sharing part, that would be my wish would be to do a cost sharing, get it done this year, and maybe give them the choice, right? If they want to do the cost sharing and we can come up with a good set of numbers, then let's go ahead with it. If not, then we'll explore it next year, and hopefully the village revenues are back to where they need to be.
What Aaron is saying makes a lot of sense to me. I agree with Aaron. And there's a risk that's inherent here, which is, will there be another rain event that's damaging? Another risk is, how is the economy going to go? If the Whites participates, they can mitigate that risk by paying for part of this. And that could make a lot of sense to them or not. It's their choice.
Could we go back and briefly the available funds and look at remind ourselves of the available funding? When we came into the last Finance Committee meeting, we were able to work some numbers that would provide some additional sources of funding and look at the 2 or 3 or 4 items that we discussed. We approved, the committee approved 2 of them at the last meeting. And then this was the third. How much of the total funding did we have? How much of the 2 projects did the 2 projects absorb that we approved? And how much funding remains in that sum? Do we have that?
We do. The village what was discussed was returning a loan to the water fund, if you will, from the general fund in the amount of $400,000 back to the general fund. And it was up to that amount. If you remember, the conversation was that $400,000, well, it's not, has not been generated by that enterprise fund. It was certainly helping propping it up. And the idea was that if you're going to transfer money back to the general fund to pull out the least amount necessary to do it, the projects that actually that are the 2 that you talked about last at the last meeting are actually on the village board's action agenda tonight, and it's into the sum of $33,100, I believe, leaving the balance of the 400 to essentially 365, if you want to talk about a number, a round number, that's available. And that this project, the pipe solution that we've been talking about, is 272,400, I think is what the number is. So it still leaves a little headspace between what could come out and go back to the general fund, and leaves a small balance in the water fund.
And what's the risk to the water fund of removing a part or all of that 400?
Again, the water fund, the water fund would become within 2 years. It would, if the village didn't raise water rates, which it would probably do, would become be funded at a level. The fund balance would be less than the village's policy. Is it 2 years out, Bettina? I'm trying to remember the fund balance.
2 years of depreciation is the number that we're using in the operating calculation. If that's what you're talking about with the 2 years.
I was trying to remember the fund balance dipping.
So it starts to dip around 2024. Okay. But just to also keep in mind that that balance number is not net position, and that's where the funding dollars for the transfer would come from. So it's a different part of the calculation in the water fund. But overall, you know, we'd be looking at different ways of funding, and one of them is through, you know, rate increases, which we haven't done.
The board, if you remember, the finance committee had been talking about putting it off this year, but probably thinking about it harder next year because of the water meter switch. They didn't want to. It's not uncommon for people who get new water meters to recognize or see an increase in fees because the new meters are actually capturing the low flows again that weren't previously being captured, and the board didn't want to double whammy them.
Right. It kind of makes sense to just see how that new implementation plays out, and then reassess how we're doing in terms of water rates.
And if I could just interrupt just for 1 second, the chart that I showed last finance committee meeting used a calculation of a repayment of 287,500, so not the full 400.
Okay.
I had just a quick question about the cost sharing aspect. I guess I'm wondering if we've ever done that before, and if we start it now, do we set a precedent then for the village that when people have water issues, that now some projects that we would say, oh, that's not really something the village would manage, we would now be looking at having to pay more costs to fix, because we've set this precedent that we could go 50-50 or 30-70 with a resident to fix their water issues. I mean, I think a lot of people have water issues. I'm just hesitant about setting that precedent.
I mean, the village used to have, and you have to help me out here, Jake. I'm gonna put you in the old timers club, but the idea that I think we've had 50-50 programs where the village pays 50%, the adjacent property owner pays 50% for both tree planting and sidewalk pouring. Has that been programs in the past?
Yeah, trees definitely. I don't know if we did the 50-50 sidewalk share. And I know for a while 50-50 storm sewer. I thought they were trying to put something in for a while when we had bad flooding in the past.
Yeah. So so the tree for sure, maybe, and all that predates.
There was years ago the sidewalk sharing cost.
Yeah, that's a pretty common program. So 50-50 sidewalk, 50-50 trees. The village, in terms of other major significant village infrastructure, the village has talked about and used special service areas, like where we're dragging water and sanitary sewer into areas that don't have it or previously were built to a different standard. The village has, I can't even think of the last time we had a special service area on the books. It's been a very, very long time. But that's a very common mechanism to implement new infrastructure. And we talked about that for this particular project, but it didn't make sense given the circumstances and that the benefiting parties was a very small universe.
And also, we're in my scenario, we're giving them the choice. The cost sharing only accelerates the project, whereas if that's not something that they want to do or can't do, then we'll just have to wait. So I think I don't mind setting that precedent. If people want a project to happen faster than the village has money for, and they want to contribute financially, I think that's a worthy program going forward.
Concur with Aaron on that.
Well, though, in terms of setting a precedent, what if we have, based on this issue, then we've got 10 projects that people want to accomplish and they're willing to cost share, but we don't have the bandwidth to do those projects. I mean, everything that we do, I'm trying to extrapolate, and given the number of places that potentially could have water issues, I do want to be cautious in saying, what do we see down the road if we make that move? It makes perfect sense to say, if you participate, we'll move it up for this particular one, but we're not really just deciding this one, we're setting that precedent. And I don't know what the ramifications are on that. And Drew, might you have a sense for, are we opening up, a dozen projects per year, or is that, just being too cautious?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could say that in any situation where you're funding program, you can only do it when the money's available, right? Mm-hmm. And then it becomes, it's subject to whatever parameters you set up. It could be total dollars. It could be part of how many households benefit. You can set up all kinds of, a rubric to which judge projects by and say, this is how we're going to put you at the head of the line and take priority over other projects. And even, so I think you can come up to that many different ways. And I don't know if I would be so concerned with setting a precedent in this COVID-19 pandemic. It's such a unique period of time. I think you could certainly kind of treat it. And I can't think of another time where there's been a project where the village has had, to step back from trying to do something due to financial downturns, and then didn't attempt to put that back in the project later. I'm thinking the 2008 recession and how the village approached those projects, and over time the village got back to reinvesting into its equipment vehicle replacement fund, and here we are with a $1 million fund balance. We got back to it. We put it off for a little period, but we got back to it, and we a new high for fund balance there. So it's those types of initiatives, they do get revisited. Projects are always re-examined, reprioritized. based off new initiatives, new possible partnerships. I mean, that happens all the time. Something get moved to the head of class because, you found out that there was a possibility to get federal dollars if we did a joint project. I'm thinking of the sanitary sewer line projects the village did jointly with Highland Park and Lake Forest several years ago because, federal dollars became available and that became the priority because there was new funding sources. So,
Right.
it's a short answer. I don't think you're setting any solid precedents here.
I guess I was just looking at it from the standpoint of not projects that the village had pointed out, but if a home, like we're looking at one home that is having an issue, so I'm sure there's other homeowners, just one home having an issue. They're now saying, oh, maybe I could go to the village and split it 50-50 rather than covering it all myself. So it would not be projects that the village had identified, but people bringing their issues to the village saying, well, based on what you did over here, can you do that for me over here, at my house? So that's kind of the way I was looking at it, not like projects that the village had already said, oh, we're going to kind of manage these. I'm talking about people coming now to the village saying, you did this for these folks on Boardman Court, and it was just their house flooding, what have you. Can you do it for my house? I'm having issues with flooding on my own. So I think it's just a different way of looking at it, but I just wanted to bring that point up because I think it's an important one to at least acknowledge and look at.
There's point also to Joy, that is, there might be a project that is very necessary for a neighborhood or a few houses or a couple houses where we are hesitant about it and where it might be very necessary, but people might not have the funds to cover for it, Those are not cheap projects, and it might be necessary. I might have 5 feet of water in my yard, but from a personal standpoint, I might not be able to afford the $100,000 to resolve that with a village.
Which is fine. In this case, we're setting the precedent of accelerating a project, not canceling the project if there's no problem, right? So in that case, in the case of homeowners who don't have the funds, then they'll just wait in line and be in that standard time frame or whatever time frame we had originally decided upon. Whereas if there is cost sharing, whether it's the homeowner or the state government or federal government, then that project can get accelerated. But I guess to Joy's point, we're looking at this Boardman Court project because of exactly what you said. The homeowners had a problem. They brought it to the village, and we were prepared to go into it 100% to fund it. So I would think that would encourage homeowners with individual problems to come to the village without any cost sharing possibility and say, well, you funded this one improvement for one homeowner 100%. Why can't you fund my problem 100%?
And if I make a distinction here, the difference, this is not a private property issue completely. Again, the other reason why this even got on the radar was because of the village's standard with respect to the roadway, right? The idea that in a less than a 10-year event, there's standing water on a roadway that is hurting the flow of traffic. It's not making it totally impossible, but it certainly makes it very difficult to pass. And the idea of it would be addressing and curing a village issue, which is one of the standards by which the village has been participating in projects, right? That's one of the standards we're trying to address.
I can't imagine if that was the only issue, we'd be even considering this project right now.
Yeah.
It is based on the criteria that you set. All of these things are very valid, everybody points out, but it will depend if in future years, what kind of criteria has been set to even consider projects. That would always be the key.
You want to set up a bidding situation then? I mean, a classical economist might find that intriguing, but that's not the way we run our village business here. But in terms of cost participation and project ranking and things like that, I guess, excuse me, in the back, I appreciate the point that you've made, Aaron. In the back of my mind, this immediately then begins to beg for it immediately begins to beg for us to have to sit down and begin to figure out prioritization relative to cost participation and things like that. I think Regis's point, we have a sizable portion of the folks in the village who are seniors who couldn't begin to afford a cost participation plan, but could significantly be injured by stormwater. And I think putting on our strategic hat, taking care of those folks and folks who are not financially wealthy, who may not have the ability to go back and remortgage a home to be able to afford. Few people have $100,000, much less 10 or 20 available to cost participate in a vital program, and that begins to from a strategic standpoint, it marks a significant shift in our in how we view our corporate responsibility in the village. And so
the point, Mark, to the point you're making, that is, if we were to put that on a weighting system, doing priorities based on number of household affected, Boardman Court would never be considered, because this is one house. Even though Jeff and Drew are saying, well, you know what, it also affects the village, but this is just one little part of the village, and West Terrace might always win because there are 100 houses that might be considered.
I do feel like we need to have some better parameters on how we decide where that money goes, because $250,000 is a lot of money to fix one home. And I mean, to be honest, I'd rather see bike path lighting go in, right? I mean, that really is for the entire village. I sympathize. I understand the whites have an issue, and I get it, but I do think that we're stewards of this money. We need to make good decisions on how we're spending it. And we should be spending it for the entire village for the most part, trying to do things for the entire village. I'm struggling with just one house being affected with this large amount of money.
But Joy, we own some of the responsibility for why that house has issues.
I guess I would say too that the owner, when they bought the house, whenever you buy a house, you do some due diligence. You look at the home, you have it inspected, you look at it and determine as well as you can if the house is placed well, if it, those are things that as a buyer you should also be responsible for. So I guess I'm struggling with where the village's responsibility falls in this versus the owners, and it's a complex problem, right? It's not an easy thing to just discern.
And what Trustee Marquis is saying resonates very well with me, which is that we have responsibility as stewards of the public funds to make sensible decisions. We have a situation here where we've had to move a project. It's timing, at least, because of the current economic situation. We're seeking solutions. We're seeking some way to do the good that government does, which is to try to accomplish a project, given the current challenges that we have. A sensible solution to that is to say to that homeowner that if you want to mitigate that risk sooner, participate, help us out with this. And as stewards of the public funds, that's a very sensible thing to do. And, to say that trying to find a solution like that is in some way turning our backs on the senior citizens in this village. A few of the things I've heard here, I do have to take exception to respectfully with that. What we're trying to put together here is a solution to help somebody. And that's one of our primary duties, or two of our primary duties: find solutions to help people and be good stewards of the public funds. And this idea of a sharing that Aaron has come forward with is very appealing in that regard. And I think Trustee Marquis' concern of the stewardship is a very important one. So, I think let's see if we can find a way to make this happen to benefit them, to benefit us for the road, and everybody wins by sharing the responsibility and the cost.
So do we need to, go ahead, Kathy.
Okay, thank you. Without laboring the issue too much, when this house was built, it was built supposedly below the recommended level. Do we have any idea of how that occurred? Why it was built supposedly below the standard? Or was it?
Kathy, my best guess is that there was a large number of ash trees in the backyard. And I believe they were trying to save the trees is the only logical thing that I could see as to why it was built lower.
And Jeff, when that was done, what was the year again?
Ooh, I think
Anyway,
it was early 80s. It was
okay.
about 32 years ago.
Okay.
So I guess the question I was going to ask is the idea, if you have a plan that shows a final finished elevation at a certain grade, and then the project gets modified in the field based off, again, maybe it's the need to try to salvage some trees, some natural elements. The change in the final finished elevation, that change of 2 feet, let's say that's what it was for argument's sake, the resulting final grade is not, I'd like to think that, but I don't know, I'm asking the question, would that have violated either a village code or any other standard other than it may not have been the best choice, or that somebody chose to make a trade-off to try to save trees for the long term, but it did not violate the code, but it was just a plan change. And maybe you don't know the answer given the time frame.
I think that's a succinct way of what I'm asking.
I don't believe there's any code that would regulate finished floor elevation on our books anyway.
So the idea that whatever that was chosen at the time by the builder to try to do that would not have, field changes happen from time to time. They change maybe the way that the trusses are connected and that don't exactly match a blueprint, but this idea of this foundation was poured and said, we're going to live with this. I mean, that would not have been,
it did not violate any of the specific village
regulations, right?
Isn't it really a civil engineering issue? I mean, all the flow of water and how high the grade is, isn't that more of a civil engineering issue? So somebody approved that the land was at level, and that's therefore the water does whatever water does, it goes to the lowest point.
Yeah, I mean, the civil engineer who put together the subdivision plan set the grading plan for the whole subdivision, and that was not followed in this Holmes case. Our system back before George Russell was not nearly as robust as it is now to look for these things and check on grades. Now we have 3 steps of reviews to follow that. We don't have any even house grading plan for that property. We didn't require them back then, so it was probably just reviewed by, and I don't know, Drew, who's in the building department, but I think it was the assistant to the village administrator was signing off, I believe, on a lot of those things at that time.
So I don't know that we can assign responsibility. I don't know that we want to forensically try to do that. It's an important question, but it may be an unanswerable question. And certainly the village somehow let this happen. And so we're here to address this project that was in the budget. We've put it on hold. And do we want to reconsider it for this year through a cost participation? And maybe just simply answering, is that something that we want to explore? And once again, we're running out of time, and we're running out of time for this meeting and for putting a number out there to see if they would even participate. We could say it's a 50-50 share and throw that out there just to have something to say. Is that something that they would be willing to participate in? And then it would get on the docket to happen this year. And should that discussion happen and people are not comfortable with that, then the project would get, in all practical purposes, have to be put off till next year because we can't complete it before the building cycle is done and it's winter again. So the question is, are we wanting to discuss a cost sharing methodology, 50-50, just to start the conversation?
I think that makes me the most comfortable. Well, actually, what makes me the most comfortable is pushing it back completely until times are better and revenues are back to normal. But I think we should give them the option, if they want to accelerate the project and do it this year, to participate.
Are you saying that this year and next year would be 100% village payment?
I think if it got put off till next year, I mean, next year, we don't have the crystal ball to know all the items that are going to be on the docket. Certainly we know a lot of projects that are currently on the list, but we don't know what else will pop up between now and then, or what items that are on the list now might grow more and more important, or, dire in terms of needing to get them done. So I don't think there's any guarantees. If it doesn't get done today, it will be on the list for next year, and we can talk about either prioritizing that or not prioritizing that in some fashion. But I'm trying to just advance the discussion to say, are we so willing to discuss it as an option for this year through cost participation, and what would you recommend that participation be? And I'm starting the conversation with a 50-50 just to start the conversation, and knowing
what's the apportionment between the road and the total project?
Can you separate the cost?
Yeah.
I don't know if that's possible.
Drew had mentioned that before.
We tried to do that, and we couldn't make the distinction in between. The engineers couldn't tie the pipe size or the improvement cost to say that 75% of it cures the road, 25% cures the whites.
All right.
I guess, and Drew and I discussed this a bit earlier today. The cheapest option to solve the whites problem is the $150,000 to put it into the neighbor's backyard, right? So I think that could be a number that we work with, whether the village can participate at that level, and then they would then pick up the rest. So they would be on the hook for 122.5. But that's a lot of money.
It is.
I don't know that they'd be willing to do that, but I think those are less arbitrary numbers than just saying 50-50.
Chair Ankerman, I'm in concurrence with Member Toll's suggestions.
Are there any other things people would like to say regarding this suggestion? Any other input?
Is there anyone online?
Glenn, do we have anyone?
There does not appear to be.
Okay, thank you. Jeff?
If I could just make a point, if you leave it as a percentage-wise, sometimes costs go up or down during construction, so that might not be able to fix that number just based on the bid. And also, there'd be the bid number of construction plus our construction engineering. We'd hire a consultant. So I guess I'd want you to clarify if they'd be sharing in that as well.
Well, so is it correct to say that the denominator is the 274 for the total project, and now we're discussing what the numerator should be? And I don't know how you can further refine that. We had 150 for the overland neighboring solution.
Roughly 5%, 55-45, based on the 272, 272,000.
So 55 being village or homeowner?
55 being village.
Okay.
If the village is going to do 150-ish, approximately 150.
Any further feedback? Drew, did you have something that you wanted to share?
Well, I would say to Bettina's point earlier with those what was the number again, Bettina, you used to the offset from the, how much money did you pull from the finance committee? From the water fund?
So 287.5 was the number that I used when I presented last week.
Okay, so
Project cost
all
and
between,
yeah.
so if that path was chosen, that would be consistent with, it'd be less than that, so that would work in terms of impact. And then the second thing, I guess, if there's a way to have, given the timing of this, we would want to reach back to the Whites and have a conversation with them. And if they are a yes, then we're going to have to work to get the project on the street and bid and so forth. So I guess I'm looking for a lot of really affirmative nods of the board members who are not on the finance committee that are comfortable with this, so that when we bring it, that there's no heartburn or concerns that would perhaps take this off a track.
Regis?
I'm comfortable with it.
Oh, thank you, Joy. Thank you, Joy.
Yeah.
And Regis, I was wanting to know your thoughts.
My thought is it's a pretty serious burden to put on the Whites. I am very hesitant. I mean, it's following Mark's comments about, you know what, not everybody can afford that.
Well, it's not a burden. It's not a have to do. It's an option to move it up to this year.
True. It is true.
Well, the question then becomes is how it's prioritized next year. And in order to prioritize it next year, then even if we ride this out, the COVID situation out, it's still going to, remember, we have a list of capital projects. Yes. And we have them rank ordered and prioritized. And so we're still going to be in that circumstance where there's now going to be, once we cross the notion of cost participation, then we now open that whole prioritization up by whatever matters to a cost participation, and we're going, as Drew pointed out or suggested, we may end up having to come up with some sort of a rubric or some methodology to be able to fairly consider these kinds of projects, whether it's the amount of money or the number of homes that are impacted or whatnot. My only point is that we're looking at a strategic shift here, right or wrong. It's a strategic shift. I think it's probably not fair to say that this is only a something. If we open the box, it's not just a situation that we open ourselves up to in this COVID situation. It's something that we open ourselves up to down the road as well. And so if we do this with open eyes, and as we fairly consider projects in the future.
Does change our methodology.
Yeah,
that's how we do it.
That's the point. That's my only point. And you know, some may take it concerned about senior citizens or folks in the community that have lesser means, but you know, that's part of the whole equation. That's part of what government's about, is us strategically determining how much we support the public good. Mm-hmm. And that's you know, it's I'm not trying to single any particular group out or not, other than the fact that we're signaling a change in how we look at projects of this nature. And I think it's stormwater is far beyond sidewalks and trees.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this would consider totally different if it was a neighborhood being affected, but in this case, it's one homeowner. And so in the public benefit, we're not really benefiting the public in this case. We're benefiting one homeowner.
Oh, I'm not arguing that point. Aaron, I'm not, because I think the point you're making does have a certain merit. All I'm suggesting is that we cross this, and we cross into a different funding and prioritization environment in the future. That's all.
But you
That's
know what,
all.
Mark, what we're doing is we could also keep it fairly simple. I mean, we can keep in mind the fact that yes, we're changing the rules of the game, and I probably agree with that very much. But we're also saying that, guess what, this year is COVID-19, we lost 25% of our budget to do those types of projects, but we're still opening the door to the whites to be done, and we'll work with them saying, if you want to do it this year, we'll share costs with you. Next year is a different story, but this year, if you want it, we will work with you.
Yeah.
And that might be a slight
Next year
difference.
might be a different story. As we keep saying, next year we don't know. If
We don't know. We could fulfill it 100% or no. Who knows?
Yeah, don't forget, next year is uncertain. We don't know where we're going to be.
Right.
Yeah,
So,
for sure.
So my question once again is, do we just want to say that we're putting it to next year and we're not going to put a cost sharing option out there, or we would like to put a cost sharing option out there? We've outlined this methodology based on alternatives to say that the village would participate at a cost of 55%, the homeowner would be 45%. Do we have a motion to make that recommendation, and the whites would then have the option to say that's too big of a number for us, we'll have to just accept that it's next year and there will be a pool of worthy projects and that will be one of them, and we'll have to prioritize based on our methodology. So I think that's kind of where we are. Do we have a, Regis, did you have, yeah.
Okay.
I'll move.
Thank you, Aaron. Did you,
All right. And I second Aaron's motion.
Okay, Drew, do we have, so we need to have a roll call vote?
Chair Ankerman,
Aye.
Member Meyer,
Aye.
Member Toll.
Aye.
Thank
And
you.
Drew, we kind of fast and muddy at the end.
No, I got it.
Okay, that's what I
Got it.
want to. That's what I want to be
Thank
sure
you
on.
thank you for checking, though.
Yeah,
All good.
it was kind of intense. So,
Yeah.
so we've got a recommendation to put together something that will be presented as a cost sharing option, and should the homeowner choose to not do that, then it will be put into the next year pool of projects to be evaluated and prioritized and either put into the budget or not.
Check.
Okay, got it. I think I've got my, I'm looking at my agenda. I think we have accomplished everything on our agenda. Have I missed anything?
The only, Jeff Hansen, would you give the Finance Committee and therefore the entire board, whoever else is present, the quick update on the Green Bay Road project with the funding? There was a memo in the packet about that.
Yes, because of all the projects that they grandfathered that they previously agreed to fund, they only were able to put 3 new projects in the next 5-year cycle.
Oh my.
Ranked 10th on that list. Amazingly, mostly because our road is in too good a shape, if you believe that. The pavement was a little bit worse, we would have ranked 4th on that list. So we are in a position where we're going to be outside the program funds. Who knows with other municipal budgets if they're going to be able to move forward with the projects that are listed for funding right now. Highland Park has 6 projects in that list for the next 5 years. As projects move out because they either can't fund them or they have delays, there could be chances for projects like ours to move into the program. Otherwise, we'll reapply in 2 years. We should get bonus points for applying 2 cycles in a row. And if we don't fix our road in the next 2 years, we should get many more points for road condition. So I would feel very good about our chances in 2 years to be funded for 2026 or 2027. But the short story is we are not going to be in the program initially for the next 5 years.
Is there a bulldozer we could borrow to drive up and down Green Bay Road or something?
They rated the road at a 46.5. The threshold for the 15 points was 45. So on a 100-point scale, it was, CMAP did that. We had no control over it or no input in it.
Accuracy, snow plowing.
Yeah.
That's why I would feel comfortable. We would probably get those 15 points 2 years from now.
Right. Well, thank you for that staff report. All right, at this point, it's 6:59. Do I have a motion to adjourn the Finance Committee meeting?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. Roll call.
Chair Ankerman,
Aye.
Member Meyer,
Aye.
Member Toll.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you. The meeting's adjourned.